Thank you very much for the invitation, Dr. Flick, and for arranging this most interesting conference. Dr. Flick has just said so many things that I wanted to say, and she said it in German, so you understood it, and now I'm going to say it in English, so you only understand half of it. But I know that you're all very good at languages, much better than I am. I have actually prepared various slides, but now how do I make this work? There. Forward. This one. Right. As you see, I've tried to put my arguments into a systematic form so that they'd be easier for you to understand. I really wanted to talk about some philosophical ideas that underpin the notion of parliamentary democracy. And the first idea, of course, is voting. We recognize that voting is an important part of democratic order in all its forms, but we also know that being voted into office is not sufficient to produce a properly accountable form of government. And already Dr. Flick has emphasized this, the idea of verantwortung, which we would translate accountability, I suppose. The idea that if you're in an office, there is a group of people defined independently, not defined by you, but defined by the office itself, to whom you are accountable. And we have seen recent events in Turkey, which Dr. Flick referred to, and also before that in Egypt, where we've had effectively very powerful popular opinion voting into office, people who are not necessarily accounting to others, and certainly not accounting to those who didn't vote for them. And the moment, that brief moment of democratic elections in Egypt, when Morsi was elected from the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, was elected as president, all the slogans in the election time held up in the great demonstrations, they said, all of us are with the Sharia. That was the great slogan behind Morsi's election campaign. And of course, we all know that 10% of Egyptians do not want to be governed by the Sharia because they're Christians, and even some atheists allowed to exist in Egypt. What about them? Was he proposing to be accountable to them? Of course not. And I think we have the same problem with Erdogan's system of government in Turkey, which is clearly extremely popular. He wants to move in the direction of a populist Islamic democracy. But he does not clearly regard himself as accountable to those who want something else. It's the goal that matters. And this kind of movement in politics was noticed and warned against in the 19th century by two great liberal thinkers, John Stuart Mill, who referred to the tyranny of the majority, and Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote of democratic despotism, the ability of majorities to impose their rule by force and extinguish the minorities that opposed them. And I think we all recognize that accountability in politics is not just accountability to those who have supported you, those who have voted for you. The much more important thing is your accountability to those who did not support you, who did not vote for you. What about them? And in a parliamentary democracy, that of course is the most important thing. Most people in Europe live under governments which they did not vote for. That's probably true even in Austria. It's certainly true in Britain, where 25% of people voted for the present Conservative government, and that's a lot. It's much better than normal. But still, 75% voted against it. But nevertheless, they regard it as their government. What makes that possible? That's the really important question that I want to put before you. Well, we do, as you know, we have emerging in our political order a new style of leader, typified by Donald Trump, who identifies himself as representing the people against the politicians, against the political class who ought to be representing them, but actually only represent themselves. That thought is in many people's minds all across the Western world at the moment, that the political class who should be accountable to us actually are accountable only to their own clique. And Donald Trump has made a lot of progress by saying that I'm different. I'm going to be accountable to you, the people. I represent you, the people. And in order to prove this, he's shown himself to possess all those qualities which the people are thought to have. You know, vulgarity, arrogance, stupidity, and so on. This amounts to, of course, to a very clever political coup. And of course, it's not true that he has all those bad qualities completely. It's all part of his cleverness. So then we have, of course, the great issue that Dr. Flick has already referred to: Britain, my country, and the EU referendum. Was Cameron making himself accountable when he opened this question to the people in a referendum? I think he thought that he was going to be accountable for the result, and when the result went against him, he resigned, which is a kind of sign that he did recognize that he had made some kind of mistake and he had to pay for it. Unlike Mr. Juncker, who, after all, was also engaged in the same negotiations, who has felt no inclination to resign then or any other time in his career, as far as one can see. Then we have this final great difficulty in our situation in Britain, that the rules for the election of the leader of the Labour Party have changed. He or she used to be elected by the members of Parliament, because after all, those were the people he had to lead. But now he's elected by the party as a whole, which has been infiltrated inevitably by the activists. So he is elected by people who are other than the ones he must lead. With the result is that he sits in Parliament, nonplussed, bewildered, staring into the distance, acknowledging only one fact, that he is the leader, but of whom and of what nobody knows. And this is extremely difficult for us. Every Parliament needs an opposition, and suddenly we don't have one. 100 years ago, when Arthur Balfour was leader of the Conservative Party in Parliament, all his party voted against him on some issue. And he was asked, well, what do you think of that? He said, well, I must follow them. I'm their leader. And that actually is a very wise political remark, but it's not one that's possible for Jeremy Corbyn to say. Right, so we do have emerging, however, a new kind of culture in politics, which you might call the plebiscite culture. And Dr. Flick, again, has already taken many of the words out of my mouth by referring to this. We recognize that thanks to the internet and mobile phones and all the things that you've been told to turn off, I hope, in this room, people are in constant contact with each other behind the backs of politicians. And every day there pops up on my screen a little petition from change.org or avaz.org, which urges me to add my voice to some petition on behalf of the victims of this or that injustice. There are Twitter storms about people who are committing terrible crimes, or people in Parliament who are not doing the right thing. And I'm given the opportunity to press a little button which says, I add my voice to this. You know, and I press that button, I can go away feeling that I've, with one click, proved my virtue. Then I don't think about it again. And every day there are hundreds of these petitions which give me the opportunity for the one-click passport to moral virtue. But is that what we really want? In adding my voice to this, am I taking responsibility in any way for the outcome? Of course not. I'm hiding behind that screen as well as using it. I'm not in the position of a member of Parliament who, if he makes the wrong decision, might be thrown out at the next election, or at least has to stand up in front of the public and justify his choice. So this kind of direct democracy introduced by the internet is essentially voiding responsibility from voting. It's separating voting on the one hand from responsibility on the other, and creating a new kind of culture, a bypassing of politics, which we see, of course, in the case of the caliphate. I mean by that ISIS, however you refer to them, Daesh or IS, the caliphate which is growing in the Middle East, or we think is growing in the Middle East, but actually is not really growing there so much as in cyberspace. You know, people are making decisions to unite around a cause, a very dangerous cause, which causes them to assassinate and murder and so on, which doesn't have any institutions of decision-making at all. You just join it through your social media, you receive instructions from the social media, and politics is left out of consideration. There's no clear policy as to how the goal can be achieved or what the goal is, other than the destruction of everything. And that must give us some sense that really politics is important, because when it's bypassed, look what you get. This potential for mass hysteria and mass murder uncontrolled by any institution or any sense of responsibility. So that raises the question, what exactly is politics and why do we need it? And we contrast, as Dr. Flick has already done, parliamentary democracy from direct democracy, the democracy that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was trying to recommend and then thought he couldn't recommend. In a parliamentary democracy, the representative in Parliament is answerable to his or her constituents. And the idea of a constituent is something that we need to examine. Rousseau thought that really democracy was about understanding the general will of the people. The representative form of democracy is not about producing a general will, it's about selecting people who are answerable to other people, and from that process of selection, developing a decision procedure. Now, yes, so here I want to just pause to contrast representation from delegation. This distinction was made by Edmund Burke, famous British parliamentarian and really the founding father of the conservative movement in our country and in America, really, in a speech in 1744 to the electors of Bristol. He was asking them to choose him as their parliamentary representative. And he made a very important point. He said that a representative is not a delegate. He's not appointed by the people who vote for him in order to relay their opinion to Parliament. He's not appointed to do that at all. He's appointed to represent them in Parliament. And he might, in the course of representing them, decide not to relay their opinion, but rather to advocate the opposite. He might think that they're completely wrong about something, which people on the whole generally are. And he might think, nevertheless, that he's still got to respond to their interests. It's their interests that matter. And that means that it's his conscience that is important, not their decision. If his responsibility is simply to relay the opinions of the people who voted for him, which is essentially Erdogan's and Morsi's view of politics, then he isn't really taking responsibility himself at all. He's offloading it onto the people who voted for him. He's saying, it's not my doing, it's their doing. I'm sorry if this is the wrong decision, but it's their decision, not mine. But a real parliamentarian is somebody who is taking a decision because he has thought it through and it's the wise thing to do, in his view, and is then holding himself responsible for it. He's saying, if it's wrong, then you can throw me out of office, I shall take responsibility, pay whatever compensation is necessary or whatever. So important in all this, Burke said, is the individual conscience. That's to say, that in me which tells me that I'm acting rightly on behalf of my constituents. So representatives, in order to do this, have to learn how to ignore their constituents. But they must also represent them. And this introduces another difficulty, which I can't possibly go into in detail, but which you're all aware of, which is the question whether this is compatible with party politics at all. You know, who are my constituents, for a start? In our system in Britain, the constituents are chosen according to a place. There are boundaries within which the electors can vote for that particular person. So he or she is supposed to be representing, say, the town of Bristol, or some part of Bristol, or some area of the countryside around Bristol. And so people defined by their place and their neighbourhood. And this, of course, is the old way in which people united, because in the days before the motor car, and especially before the internet, communication was between neighbours. And they are the people who are still represented officially in our parliament. And you have things a bit like this in the upper house of the German parliament as well, and some version of it in the French parliament, though much distorted by party politics. But the problem is that to get into the position of being elected by the people of Malmesbury, I first have to be chosen by the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or some other party as their candidate, because people will be always voting according to their sense of how this person's going to be behaving in Parliament, and that's going to be affected by his party membership. So there is a conflict. Am I representing the people of my constituency when I'm in Parliament, or the party that got me there? Now, this is an important question, because among the people in my constituency, there is probably 50% at least who actually hate the party that got me there to represent them. So to what have I got the same obligation to them as I have for the others who voted for me? That's one of the questions which I think obviously Mr. Trump, in his loud way, has put on the agenda. So this brings me to another thought. Again, Dr. Flick has touched on this, the notion of authority. Representation, as I'm describing it, is an office. That's to say, it's a set of duties and rights. A person who is a representative has some duties towards his constituents and also some rights in Parliament and elsewhere. So it's an office that's occupied by the individual. But the representatives are authorised by the electors. And the electors give them the authority, in other words, the people who voted for them, give them the authority to make decisions on their behalf. And authority, as Dr. Flick said, is not the same as power. It's a different idea altogether. It's a moral idea, not a causative idea. You know, I have authority on this topic of Wagner's late operas. I am an authority on this, but I have no power to persuade you of this fact at all. But, you know, this is part of my moral identity that I can claim. But what powers it gives me, I just don't know. It has not yet got me a free ticket to a Wagner opera or anything like that. And that's a small example of a distinction that we all make all the time. We know that politicians have powers, but not all of them have equal authority. Sometimes a politician steps forward as having genuine authority in a matter, and that comes partly because people confer authority on him through trusting him. You know, authority is connected with the idea of trust, and not everybody who has power is trusted. Most people who have power are not trusted, usually rightly. So authority, when it exists, can be conferred by an institution that already possesses it. If I am a judge, I have the authority to appoint a clerk of the court to take notes. So my authority as judge authorizes him to do something. I can pass authority down. In an army, an officer has authority which he can pass to a junior who passes it on. You know, he said, I authorize you to do this, or and the junior takes that authority as given. But how does the institution get it? Right? We understand how authority can be passed down from the one who has it to the one to whom it is delegated, but how can it be passed up? That's the great question of politics. How is authority passed up from people who don't have it to the person who then possesses it? Ultimately, authority comes when people are accountable to those with less power than themselves. Everybody knows that they have to be accountable to people with more power than themselves, up to a point, but the real authority comes from below, from people who have less power than the ones who are given that authority. And that this can happen is a miracle. Looking back over the Arab Spring, you can see this. In the Arab Spring, countries which were governed by people with top-down authority, which they had seized, as it were, from the web of history, were suddenly overthrown. But they were replaced by the same kind of thing. The situation that was created was no different from the one that was destroyed, because the situation that was created was not one in which the people conferred authority on the leaders. It was still one in which the leaders themselves took this authority without answering to the people below them. All right, so I recognize I have to hurry now, so I'll go very quickly through this. We often think that it's public opinion that really matters in a parliament. That's the thing that the parliament is trying to define. And this is right, because parliaments follow procedures. They are instruments for the formation of public opinion. They're not just there to relay it. They don't just respond to what the crowd emotion of the day is. They're not the result of a Twitter storm. They are trying to shape opinion and relay that opinion back to the people. So there's an importance of dialogue and opposition in shaping public opinion as something shared. And that was very important in the recent referendum in our country. People may not know what they think, but it's dangerous to act on this directly. You know, the communist idea was that the party speaks for the proletariat. And they don't have a voice at all. But we know that people do have a voice, but it still must be shaped in some way so that it can be made into something public and answerable. So the emergence of public opinion in a democracy is distinct from the stirring up of the crowd. And we've seen this stirring up recently with Erdogan's behavior after the attempted coup in Turkey, this mass emotion designed to cast a light of legitimacy on him. And it was beautifully described, of course, or dramatized by Shakespeare in his portrait of Mark Antony's speech following the murder of Julius Caesar in the play of that name. And we know that kind of stirring of crowd emotion is not the same as the formation of public opinion. So I just want to conclude with a few thoughts about the referendum. I know this is terribly controversial, and everybody in this room has feelings about it, but let's face it, everybody in my country has feelings about it too, and we have the additional problem that we have to live with it. I'll try and lower the temperature. So people wonder whether this isn't just an instance of this plebiscite culture. Shouldn't the politicians have taken full responsibility for this matter of our membership of the European Union and debated it rationally in Parliament? Why hand it over to the people? Well, there have been two referenda in Britain recently. There's one about Scotland and one about the EU. And the reason why referenda were chosen was effectively because the question to decide was not one of policy, or not merely one of policy, but one of identity. Are we one thing? In the case of Scotland, is this one nation or two? And we asked the Scots what they thought. It was a very a phony referendum because the English weren't asked what they thought. You know, unlike the referendum over Czechoslovakia, where both the Czechs and the Slovaks were asked what they thought, we only asked the Scots what they thought. And they thought that they belonged with us, with the English, in a single nation state. In the case of it's the same question in the case of the EU, and it takes me back to the point from which I began, and this is what I want to conclude on, that democratic governments rarely enjoy a majority vote. So there is a big question: why do we accept to be governed by people we didn't vote for? Why do you accept to be governed by people you hate? In the Middle East, nobody has accepted this. That's why there's a permanent problem there. And yet we do accept it. And that's because we have a pre-political sense of identity, a sense that we belong together. There's a first-person plural, which is us. And it's to that first-person plural that the politician is accountable. So he must be accountable not only to those who voted for him, but to those who didn't, and especially those who didn't. And that is not the relation in which the European institutions stand to the people of Europe. There is not a first-person plural of Europe which creates such a we, and a first-person plural which makes them accountable to those who do not like them as much as those who do. And this is, I think, just to explain why I think that people voted the way they did, that people did not accept to be governed by a treaty. In a parliamentary democracy, legislation changes and constitutions evolve according to the will of the people. But when legislation is controlled by a treaty, and the treaty itself can only be changed by a majority signature of the people who are part of it, the legislative process stagnates. And we've seen this especially in connection with what for the British people is the most critical feature of the Treaty of Rome, namely that providing for freedom of movement. Freedom of movement has not been a problem to the Poles, because how many people in the world speak Polish? You know, those who do are already in Poland. But everybody, with any sense, speaks English. So we have an unlimited inflow of migrants, getting more and more all the time. And people, ordinary people, saw their schools, their jobs, their healthcare system and everything suddenly being taken away by people with whom they do not identify through a first-person plural. That's really what explained the vote. But they also knew that because of the treaty, they couldn't change this. If you're governed by a treaty, there is no way in which you can change the law, because the law has been confiscated from you. And this is what Parliament had been saying to people for the last 20 years in response to their objections. It had been saying, look, we're not accountable to you for this matter because it's been taken out of our hands. And I think the people of Britain said, no, you must be accountable for it because it is the matter that is most important to us, the question of who we are. So there was a breakdown of accountability, and it's had this very difficult result, which has led to all kinds of problems and distrust between people. And the question that's in everybody's mind is, does the referendum that has occurred help to remedy this breakdown of accountability, or has it made it worse? And I won't answer that question for you. I shall just give up at this point. Thank you. Thank you.